All right, guys. So these were the topics that you guys asked that we go through again based on the quiz responses from yesterday. So yeah, just I guess the most common one that most of you asked for was potential confounding variables. So I think we'll try to spend a little bit more time on that one. Also, some of you, or I think multiple people also asked about reliability and validity. So we'll try to spend more time on these two, but we'll also cover the rest. So if we go in terms of the order, we'll start with 1B. In fact, what I'll do is I'll just take a screenshot of this so I don't have to keep going back. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if I just go back to 1B first. Okay. So 1B basically looks at scientific research methodologies. So scientific research methodologies are basically ways that we collect research. So spread 1B goes through all the different things that we can do, all the different methods that we can use in order to collect research or collect data. Okay, if you remember when we first started this spread back in Unit 1, I mentioned that although experiments are the most common way for us to collect data in psychological or scientific research, there are other ways that we can also use to collect data. We don't have to necessarily run a full-blown experiment to actually collect data. We can do, for example, a questionnaire. Okay, if you want to collect data for a project at school, you might go around to classrooms and you might do a survey with students in each class. That's a questionnaire. That's not an experiment, but that's a way that you can still collect data. Okay, you might do something like a case study, okay, where you choose one person or you choose a specific group of people and you study them over a specific period of time. Okay, so if you remember when we were doing, when we were looking at that movie, Three Identical Strangers, okay, that was basically a long-term case study of those three individuals and how they were separated at birth and all that stuff. So basically, that is still a way that we can collect data. It's not an experiment, but it's still a way that we can collect data. Okay. Sometimes we can do interviews to collect data. Okay. Sometimes we can do self-reports, which are basically like I give you, again, a questionnaire and I ask you to rate yourself. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how stressed were you in the past week? How anxious were you in the past week? Again, this is not an experiment, but this is still a way that we can collect data. So research methodologies are basically ways in which we collect data. Okay, an experiment being the main one, but these others also coming under that heading as well. Okay, and remember, guys, when we do an experiment, we often use one or more of the others, so one or more of the other research methodologies in our experiment to collect data as well. So if I'm doing an experiment on the effect of keeping a diary on stress levels, okay? So the effect of having a diary in terms of how it allows you to keep your stress in check and keep you organized and stuff. If I'm doing an experiment on that, obviously it's an experiment because I'm testing two variables, the IV and the DV, keeping the diary and then stress levels, but I'm also using other methods. So I might give my participants a questionnaire, okay, asking them, okay, how do you feel when you keep a diary compared to when you don't keep one? Do you feel more organized? Okay, and I might be trying to elicit an answer from them there. So experiments often use one or more of the other research methodologies as well. So simply put, research methodologies help us to collect data. Okay, each of the research methodologies it's just important for you to know what the definition of that research methodology is, as well as one advantage and disadvantage. So the first one is experiments. Experiments test the cause-effect relationship. Okay, and it often does so in controlled conditions. So we're talking like a lab, we're talking like a place where you can actually easily manipulate and control those conditions. I remember when I gave you guys the example earlier in the year that if I was doing a really important experiment, whether it's an experiment like a chemistry experiment or whether it's like a psychological experiment, I always have to make sure I'm doing that in a place that I can control the conditions, okay, where external variables or extraneous variables like the weather or a sudden thunderstorm don't affect my ability to run the experiment. So lab is the most common example of one. The cause-effect relationship is always between the IV, which is known as the cause, and the DV, okay? If you don't have a cause-effect relationship happening, or you don't have an IV and a clear DV, then you can't really classify that as an experiment. Okay, one advantage of an experiment is, like I said, we can control the variables. Well, one disadvantage though is that even though we can control the variables like things like weather and that kind of stuff, we can't actually control everything. And we know that there is something called potential confounding variables, which are the unwanted variables that come up. Okay. Also, we can't always measure every single variable out there. For example, I can't measure something like happiness. Okay, I can tell if someone's happy by looking at their face, and seeing them smile. I can maybe even look for the neurotransmitters in their brain, okay, and to see whether they're releasing dopamine or serotonin or those kind of happy mood-related neurotransmitters. But I can't measure something like happiness as accurately as I can measure something like heart rate or body temperature, okay, because those are more objective measurements, whereas happiness is more kind of subjective. Okay, so that's basically one disadvantage of experiments there. The next one that we're looking at is self-reports. So self-reports can either be written or spoken responses. Okay, basically what that means is I can either ask the participant to write about their experiences, or I can ask the participant to speak. Okay, so that's the idea. And self-reports often use one or more of the other research methodologies. Like we usually use questionnaires within self-reports. Okay, we can use an interview, we can use rating scale. So all of these kind of come under the heading of self-reports. One advantage of a self-report is that it's quite subjective, and so we can get a lot of rich personalized detail. So if this is, let's say, Ibrahim's writing a description of his sleep experience. Okay, he's trying to describe how his sleep was the previous night. If I'm a sleep researcher or I'm an experimenter and I'm looking at sleep patterns, what he writes in that diary is very useful information for me. It's personalized detail which has been personalized to him. It's detail I can't just get by Googling online. Okay, it's detail that I need only from him. So self-reports are good in that way, that they can give you a lot of rich detail that you can't get anywhere else. But self-reports are bad because, again, in the same way that the person can write the information, they can also lie about the information. So for that reason, sometimes because people can lie, because people can exaggerate their responses, so Ibrahim might tell me, oh yeah, I slept for 10 hours last night, but actually he pulled an all-nighter and didn't sleep at all. That can lead to inaccurate results there. Okay, so that's the self-reports. Questionnaires, again, like I said, questionnaires, interviews, and rating scales are all a part of self-reports. So these are things that we can use within a self-report. They're not really, we can use them as separate, we can use questionnaires, interviews, and rating scales as separate research methodologies as well, but we generally don't. We generally use them within a self-report. The main reason being that questionnaires, interviews, and rating scales basically all have a common feature in terms of collecting data from a participant, and that data is often personalized to that person. It's rich in their personal detail there, and we can't get that information anywhere else. Okay, that's why people go around, even though it's annoying, people go around conducting questionnaires. It is time consuming. Obviously, you have to go around with a questionnaire booklet, or you have to go around, sending the link to the online questionnaire if it's an online one. But the reason that people do it is that you can't get that information anywhere else. You can't get that through Google. You can't get that through a search engine. Okay, it's something that you can only get from the person directly. So questionnaires are good because they can be conducted anonymously. Remember when you guys did the quiz yesterday and I said you guys don't have to write your name? A lot of you wrote your name, but most of you didn't write your name, which again allows you to be more honest in your responses. Okay, you might feel maybe hesitant to mention which topics were difficult for you if you wrote your real name, whereas if you were anonymous, you're more likely to be honest. Okay, questionnaires are also most commonly conducted through surveys, which we talked about before. Okay, and we can conduct, or we can get a large amount of information from a short amount of time. So within that half an hour, 1 hour quiz yesterday, I was able to generate a lot of data in terms of which questions most people got right, which questions most people got wrong, and the topics that you guys needed help with. And I didn't have to come around knocking to each of your houses. It was able to be done so quickly. Okay, so that's the basic idea. An advantage of questionnaires are they're so easy to create, they're easy to do and they're easy to score and easy to conduct as well. Okay, you just need like a link, or you just need to give them a piece of paper and get them to fill it out. There's no big process there. A disadvantage though is just like self-report, questionnaires can be biased. Okay, I don't know how many of you, particularly those of you who were anonymous in the quiz yesterday, how many of you took the quiz seriously, or how many of you did the quiz genuinely, okay, or gave it your best effort. So again, this can be affected by bias, just like any self-report can be. When we're looking at interviews, what we're looking at is we're looking at this idea of asking the person questions, and usually interviews are done like with verbal communication. Okay, so either we talk to the person face to face, or we talk to the person, especially in today's climate, we talk to the person on Zoom or Skype or FaceTime. Okay, so either face to face, or it can be through some online method, but you're still talking to that person like face to face in a verbal way. Okay, even if it's online, it's still face to face. There's also something called phone meetings as well. Okay, so sometimes interviews don't necessarily have to include face to face contact, but it's still verbal via being on the phone. These are probably less common though compared to the face to face ones. Okay, and probably becoming even more less common today in our world of Zoom and all that stuff. An advantage of an interview is that it allows for us to collect data on sensitive or personal topics. I'm not going to ask you a really personal topic on an online questionnaire. It's a little bit insensitive. So I would rather do that when I've got you in front of me, and when I can, like, you know, kind of help you to adjust better to that question, or help you if that question upsets you. Okay. Also, interviews can be more interactive because you are talking to a real person rather than answering stuff on a computer screen. But disadvantages of interviews are that they can be quite time consuming, and you can't collect data on multiple people at the same time. Okay, like when we did the quiz yesterday, I was able to get a lot of data from a lot of you about, you know, how you did on the quiz, what topics you found difficult. If I was to call each of your house phones yesterday and be like, okay, what questions did you guys find most difficult? What topics? It would have taken me the whole day to get through the whole class. So interviews are good, but only when you're dealing with a small number of people. If you're dealing with collecting data for huge numbers of people, it can be more difficult. Interviews are not as practical in that sense. Okay, rating scales are just simply scales where you rate something on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, or not important, most important, strongly disagree, strongly agree. We've all probably done some form of rating scale one way or the other throughout our lives. Okay, either in surveys or in feedback sessions after a workshop, for example. Okay, rating scales are again good because they're quick and inexpensive to conduct, but people can experience convenience bias. Convenience bias is basically that thing that happens when you start doing multiple questions like this, and you're like, let me just, you know, write very important for this one, and you don't even read the question anymore. You just start making a pattern, or you just start doing everything as the same column. Okay, that's called convenience bias. Just a fancy way of saying you're lazy. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Observational studies are watching someone either in the natural environment or in a controlled observation setting. So for example, either in the natural environment, like I go and observe children in kindergarten playing in the actual kindergarten. So just to see how their social development, social behaviors are. So that could be natural observation, observing them in the natural setting. Okay, natural observation, naturalistic observation is always better because basically it allows us to see the real behavior. Okay, without any influence there. Controlled observation is okay. Controlled observation is, remember last year when we looked at this year. Remember this year when we looked at attachment studies and the baby in the room and then the stranger comes in, the strange situation experiment. That's an example of a controlled observation because the baby wasn't in their real home. The baby was in the lab that the experimenter had created with a bunch of toys. And that's called a structured setting. What that means is the baby might not behave as naturally or as genuinely or as authentically as they might have behaved if they were actually at home with their own toys. Okay, an advantage of observational studies is that we can note down behavior and the consequences as they occur naturally in that person's environment. However, a disadvantage is that participant behavior can change if they're knowing, if the person knows that they're being observed. Okay, so the minute that the child knows that someone is watching them, they might start to behave a little bit differently there. Okay, and this is human nature for us to behave differently if people are watching us. So that's the basic idea behind observational studies. Case studies is an in-depth investigation. Okay, case studies are different from observational studies because observational studies, yep, go in for 2 hours on Monday, observe a few children playing at kindergarten during recess time, and then go back home. But case studies are longer, okay? They're longer analysis. For example, if you think of Phineas Gage, okay? Researchers were so interested in his, rare kind of condition where an iron rod had gone through his head. They studied him for years, okay, probably 10, 20, 30 years. Literally from when he had the accident to when he passed away, he was being studied. Same thing with Jeannie, okay? Jeannie also was studied for many, many years. She's still alive, but even now people are like, where is she? We want to study her more. Okay, but obviously the mum said, no, you have to stop. And she's kind of like where she is now is completely unknown because people were so interested in studying her. Obviously it was for Jeannie's well-being, but you can see how case studies are in-depth investigations and they are very time intensive, okay? The reason that they're very time intensive is that these people who are often studied for case studies or who are often the subject of these case studies have rare conditions, okay? They have rare conditions that are not really prevalent or common within the general community. We don't see kids like Jeannie every day. We don't see people like Phineas Gage every day. We don't see stories like what we saw in the Three Identical Strangers documentary every day. So those people became really kind of areas of interest for researchers and experimenters. Okay, so that's what a case study is. Case studies are good because they allow us to generate a lot of detailed information and insights, particularly on informational conditions that are not really common. But that's also the disadvantage because when you're studying something that's not really common, if Phineas Gage passes away or Jeannie passes away, you don't have anyone else to continue your research on. Those were the people that you were focusing on. When they're gone, your research is gone as well, unless we get another person like Jeannie or another person like Phineas Gage, which is going to be very uncommon there. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind case studies. When we look at longitudinal studies gather data from same participants over a long period of time. So if you remember that 7UP, so 7UP is basically tracking a bunch of British children from the ages of 7 and tracking them, I think, every 7 years. So they started at 7 and then they were tracked again at 14, again at 21, until they reached about 63 years of age. So you can see that this is the boy when he's 7 years old, and then when he's 63, that's what he kind of looks like, and the same with the others. And this was a longitudinal study because we're studying these individuals over a very long period of time, an extended period of time. And what we see is we kind of get a little film strip of that person's life. So what their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors were like when they were 7, what their attitudes were like when they were 14, how those attitudes, thoughts, feelings changed when they were 21 compared to 28, compared to 35. So we're almost getting like a little mini movie of that person's life. Okay, it allows us to generate a lot of detailed information and allows us to see how that person at different periods or in different eras of their life were different, how they were influenced by what was happening in the world around them, for example. A disadvantage, though, is that people can drop out, okay? As with anything that takes a lot of time, people get impatient, people might get over it. This girl, for example, she did stay till the end, but this girl might be like, I don't want to be in this anymore when she's 21, and she might just drop out. And she has all the right to do that because she's got withdrawal rights there. Okay, so obviously, even though longitudinal studies can allow us to get so much valuable information about the lifespan and about development, we can only really do that if the person allows that to happen. If the person says, no way, I'm not having any of it, there goes your longitudinal study. Okay, so that's the longitudinal studies. Cross-sectional studies are the same thing, but rather than studying someone like over a long period of time, we're basically studying them at one specific period of time. So it's like if I were to take these people and only study them in 1964 or only study them in 2002, just 1 year, rather than a long period of time. That's what cross-sectional study is. So if I take all these people in this picture here, the grandma and her grandchildren, and I look at their stress levels in 2018 or 2020, that's one particular year. Okay, it's just providing me with a snapshot. I'm not getting a mini movie of their life. I'm not getting a film strip of their life experiences. I'm just getting a little snapshot. It's like taking a picture of their life at that particular period of time. So that's what a cross-sectional study is. Cross-sectional studies are less likely for participants to drop out because it's not as time consuming or as time intensive. But the issue is that when you're assessing different age groups, you're not really taking into consideration the fact that the grandma has lived through so much more and maybe a lot more trauma than the kids have lived through, okay, or the grandkids have lived through. And so because the age related difference are there, that can lead to a lot of unwanted variables there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Differentiating between cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies basically means that when we're talking about cross-sectional studies, we're studying different groups at the same time, whereas longitudinal studies, we're studying the same group over a specific, over an extended period of time there. Okay, so that's the basic difference between the two. And yeah, this goes back into experimental groups. I think we know what experimental groups are. Experimental group is just the group that's exposed to the IV, whereas the control group is not exposed to the IV. Okay, the control group is always used, remember, CO for control group, CO for comparison purposes. The experimental research design, so independent groups design is when we're allocating participants to either of two groups. So some participants go to the experimental group, some participants go to the control group, and they're always separate people there. So you can see that the names on the experimental group are different people and the names on the control group are different people. That's why we have the not equal sign there, because this group or the people in this group are not the same as the people in this group. They are all different people. Okay, that's why we say independent groups design. One group is independent of or different to the other group there. Okay, independent groups design or any type of research design is just a way that we use to organize participants. Once we've selected them into our study, we now need to decide, okay, who's going to be our experimental group, who's going to be our control group, and then we need to organize them into those groups, okay? So that's what research designs are for. The next type of research design is the repeated measures design. That's a little bit different. The repeated measures design basically looks at experimental and control conditions of the study, and basically talks about the same participants going through both conditions there. So the same participant will go through the experimental condition as well as the control condition. So if this is a study about the effect of music on concentration, Scott will go through the experimental condition for a few days, listen to music and see how he does on a quiz. And then the same Scott will again go through the control condition where he doesn't listen to music for a few days and then completes the same quiz again. And then we'll compare his results on both quizzes and see if he gets a higher percentage on the quiz after listening to music, and if all the other participants show a similar trend there where they get a higher percentage on the quiz after listening to music, we can say that this hypothesis may be supported that yes, music is effective for academic performance or for quiz performance there. Okay, even though the repeated measures design is good, it has something called the order effects. Order effects means that participants' performance can be disrupted if they get too bored or too tired, okay? Or that their performance can actually be improved because they're constantly practicing or constantly doing the same tasks again. Okay, order effects can either way, whether they improve your performance or whether they weaken your performance, it's still an unwanted variable because it's not giving us a true indicator of that person's performance there. And the last type of research design is called the matched participants design. So the matched participants design allows the experimenter to pair participants who have similar characteristics, traits, or qualities. What that means is, for example, I'm not using the same person, but I'm using a matched pair, which basically means that I would expect that if I'm doing a study on driving ability, the lady here in condition A or the experimental group probably has 5 years of driving experience, and so does the man in the group that corresponds to her. Okay, so what happens is they actually become a pair. So participant A here will pair up with participant 1 here. Okay, in participant E, maybe she's been driving for 20 years. Okay, so what happens is this 20-year experience, kind of driving experience lady, or E, will pair up with number 5 here, who also, this guy also has 20 years of driving experience. And so they pair up and they become a matched pair. And so what happens is this lady will go through the experimental condition And then this man will go through the control condition. So they become a pair with one of the pair going through the experimental group and one of the pair being in the control group. Okay, and we say they're not the same because they are not the same people. They're similar in terms of their characteristics, but it's not the same people that we're reusing for each condition there. So matched participants design is good because there are lower individual participant differences. There's no order effect as well. But the issue is that actually matching people on characteristics and saying, oh, you guys are similar, you become a pair, it's easier said than done. It's also very time consuming. And a lot of the time, in order to do this, we've got to go through agencies that actually recruit people, okay, and recruit matched pairs there. We can't just do it ourselves because it's hard to find people who are exactly similar in just our normal social environment there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Okay, that's a summary table for the 3 experimental designs. We've already gone through them though. And that's just the evaluation, which we've also gone through. Okay, so the next topic was, I believe, 1D. Okay, 1D talks all about unwanted variables. So we're talking about extraneous variables and potential confounding variables. Extraneous variables are basically looking at unwanted variables, usually related to the environment. Okay, they're usually some kind of outside factor there. So we're talking about like light, noise, temperature, setting, all that kind of stuff. Potential confounding variables are a factor other than the IV that has a systematic effect on the DV. And a lot of the time, what we mean by systematic is that it has an effect on the DV, but it's not always obvious at the beginning. Okay, if we're doing a quiz, okay, if I'm, for example, getting you guys to listen to music and then we do a quiz afterwards, one of you might say, Miss, the lights are off. Can we turn the lights on? So we notice that straight away and we fix that problem straight away. Potential confounding variables are not as obvious. Okay, so they're not as obvious as extraneous variables, and they're the kind of variables that kind of slip through. Okay, they're the sneaky variables that slip through and eventually affect our results there. So that's the idea. When we're looking at extraneous and potential confounding variables, both of them have similar effects in the sense that they make it difficult for us to determine with confidence whether it was the IV that caused the change in the DV or whether it was another variable. So that's the main idea there. Okay, if we do a study on the effect of, again, drinking coffee on SAC results, so drinking coffee before doing a SAC and how that affects your SAC results, if the lights are not on enough in the classroom or it's not bright enough, or if there's too much noise happening because there's construction going on next door, and some of you get affected in terms of those variables, it makes it difficult for me to then determine, was it the coffee that caused the change in the result, or was it the lack of coffee that caused the change in the result, or was it the excess noise outside? Was it the lack of brightness in the classroom? Was it the students who were talking too much and making noise at the back of the class? So it becomes difficult for me to determine with confidence that yes, the IV caused the change in the DV. And remember, guys, that's the ideal situation we want. We want a situation where we can say, yes, the IV did cause the change in the DV and that no extraneous variables had a role in that. Okay, so that's the basic idea there. Extraneous variables, like I said before, tend to be environmental variables, not always, but most of the time. They can also be eradicated before they have a major impact. So if we're doing an online quiz and I notice that some people are having technical issues, I might be like, okay, guys, I think we should just do the quiz another day because some of your performances will be affected if we do it today. So that's the basic idea. Okay, that's why we say they can be environmental, but not always weather related or climate related. They can be technical issue related as well. Potential confounding variables, there's a specific list that Vika wants us to know. So those are the only ones we really need to know. Okay, this is the list there. We need to know individual participant differences, order effects, placebo effect, experimenter effect, and non-standardized instructions and procedures. And we need to know the ways that we control for those as well. So when we're looking at individual participant differences, we're looking at any kind of participant variables that differentiate us, one person from another. So if we're doing a quiz, level of student motivation, how fast students type, okay? Some of you type faster than others on the EP SACs, and those of you who type fast are advantaged, okay? You get the SAC done quicker, you're able to write more in the same time that others write less. Okay, so those kinds of variables are individual participant differences, and they do affect your ability and your performance. Okay, so in order to control for or minimize the effect of potential confounding variables, what we're doing is we need to either use a repeated measures design, okay, where the same participant goes through both conditions. So we're reducing those individual differences there. We need to have a very large sample size. So rather than having a sample size of 10 or 20, we increase that to like 100 or 200, because what happens with larger sample sizes is that the individual differences become balanced out and they have less of an impact. Also, we need to take measures to match participants on variables. So if we can't use a repeated measures design, let's try and use a matched participants design. Okay, so those are the ways that we can control for the effect of participant variables like individual participant differences. The use of non-standardized instructions and procedures basically means that when we are talking about like two experimenters running a study, if one experimenter is giving really detailed information about the procedure and the instructions for the study, but the other experimenter is not, this first experimenter's participants are going to perform better because they were more clear on what to expect, whereas this experimenter's participants might still be confused. They might make mistakes on the experiment, not because of their performance, but because they weren't told any better from their experimenter. Okay, so that's why non-standardized means non-standardized or not the same. Okay, when we give instructions, even if you're using more than one experiment in a study, they need to be given a script, and that script needs to be written read word to word. If one experimenter is more happy with the participants compared to another, that can even influence how participants act and how participants respond to the experiment. Okay, if your experimenter is grumpy, doesn't even smile, you might be like, stuff this, I don't want to be in your experiment anymore. I'm not going to take it seriously. Okay, as a participant, you might behave differently there. So that's non-standardized instructions and procedures. Order effects, as we know, we learned about this in repeated measures design. Basically, order effects is when we go through a particular experiment and we do things in a particular order, and we have to go through that in terms of like a repeated trial. So we come on Monday, listen to the music, do the test, come on Tuesday, do it again. What happens is we either get better in terms of our performance or we get worse because we just get so tired of doing the same thing. So either we get better because of practice or we get worse because of things like boredom or exhaustion. Okay, how do we control for order effects? Rather than giving the same order of tasks where you're going A, B, B, A every day, you're going A, B, B, A, B, B, A. So you're actually switching up. You're switching up the order of the tasks there. Okay, so you're switching up the order of the tasks. That's the main thing we're talking about. Okay, so that's basically called counterbalancing. Counterbalancing is when we switch up the order of the tasks or the sequence of the tasks. So the participants are not going through the same sequence of tasks, but they're matching, they're kind of mixing it up, okay? And so this might actually help to keep their interest and stop to kind of not affect their performance in the way that it usually might. So when we're talking about the experimenter effect is basically how the researcher acts and how that might place expectations on a group. So if I come into a class and be like, okay, guys, today we're doing an experiment on the effect of green tea consumption on SAC performance, and I keep boasting or I keep bragging about this new green tea I have, and I'm like, oh guys, it's going to really help you. I drank it and it helped me concentrate so much better. What I'm doing there is I'm actually placing expectations on you in terms of how you should behave. Even if I'm doing that consciously or unconsciously, it's still going to affect your own behavior because it's affecting how you're going to respond to that IV. You might drink the green tea and feel nothing, but you remember what I said, and then you start responding in that way. You start being like, oh yeah, I can feel like I'm concentrating better now, even though you're probably not. How can we control for or minimize the effect? Well, with the double blind procedure, that's basically where the experimenter doesn't know who's getting the IV and the participants don't know who's getting the IV. If I don't know who's getting the green tea, I can't place my expectations on them. That's the basic idea. Okay, so that's the double blind procedure. Double blind meaning both groups, both the participants and the experimenter are blind or are unaware as to who is getting the experimental treatment or the IV there. With the placebo effect, it's kind of similar to the experimenter effect, except with the placebo effect, it's not the experimenter that places the expectations on the participant, it's the participant themselves. So the participant themselves sees the green tea and then starts to think that, oh, green tea is normally good for you. I've read a lot about it online. should be good for my concentration levels. This should be good for my focus levels. Okay, so they start to put the expectations on themselves. How we control for the single blind procedure is through how we control for the placebo effect is through a procedure called the single blind procedure, where we don't tell the participants. As the experimenter, they know who's getting the IV, but the participants don't know. If you don't know if you're in the control group or the experimental group, you can't really assume that this is what's going to happen, or you can't assume that you're getting the experimental treatment, because you could just be getting a placebo, which is a fake treatment. So you can't really change your behavior if a single blind procedure is implemented there. Okay, some sampling procedures can be used. And I think there was a question about what's the difference between stratified sampling and random stratified sampling. So stratified sampling is where we're basically taking a cohort or taking a population, for example, high school students. Okay, and we know in high school students, there are different groups that we can divide them into. For example, you can divide them into year 7, year 8, can't write, year 9. Okay, year 10, you can divide this into many groups, yeah? When we divide them into groups and we pick a number of students from each, for example, the top 3 math students of year 7, and pick them. Top 3 math students in year 8, pick them. Top 3 math students in year 9, pick them, and top 3 in year 10. So what I'm getting is I'm getting about 3, 6, 9, 12 participants in total that represent each of the year levels in my school, or in other words, each of the levels or layers in that population, layers or levels. That's what stratified sampling is. Random stratified sampling is the same process, but forget the top 3 math students. I'm just putting all the math students, let's say there's 200 students in year 7, taking all 200 of their names, putting them in a computer, and whichever 3 just get randomly drawn or randomly picked. Doesn't matter about their ability, don't have to be top, don't have to be low level. Whichever 3 get picked, those are my sample. Okay, put the 150 year 8 students' names in a computer. Whichever 3 get randomly picked, they are my sample for year 8. The same thing for year 9, same thing for year 10. What you find now is that you can't be picky here. You can't say, oh, I only want the top 3 math students in each year level. No, you can't be picky, because random stratified sampling is literally stratified sampling, but you're randomizing the process. So you're allowing everyone in that population to have an equal chance of being selected there. Okay, that's the main difference between the two. One uses randomization, which is basically allowing everyone to have an equal chance of being selected, like it's an open playing field. Stratified sampling is more selective. So remember, S4 stratified, S4 selective. Okay, you can be picky. You can say, I only want the top 3 math students. You don't have to just settle for randomizing the population there. Okay, so that's the difference between those two. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do, guys, now we don't have a lot of time. I think we just had one more topic to cover. So what we'll do on Thursdays, we'll cover that before we look at our scenario questions. Alrighty, so what I want you guys to do for the rest of today is, again, just go through your PowerPoint for research methods. No extra work for today or homework for today. Just go through your research methods PowerPoint. And if there's any other topics you guys need help with, just bring them on Thursday and we can have a look. Okay. All right. Have a nice day, everyone. Take care. Bye.